today's World Insight.
Vive la France!
A second 5-year term for incumbent French President Emmanuel Macron. What does this win mean for France, the European Union, and the world?
Hello and welcome to World Insight. I'm Tian Wei. Emmanuel Macron has won France's presidential election, fending off a historic challenger from far-right candidate Marine Le Pen during Sunday's runoff vote. Chinese President Xi Jinping on Monday congratulated Macron on his re-election. Macron took 58.5% of Sunday's vote, making him the first French leader to win re-election in 20 years. After his win, Macron pledged to make France more independent, make Europe stronger, and continue to make France a great ecological nation. Although Macron has won the election, the far right proved their support amongst the French electorate. At a time when Europe and the West are increasingly looking to Paris to take a leading role in confronting some of the world's biggest challenges, such as the pandemic and the Russian-Ukraine conflict, how will Macron's presidency affect France's relationship with the rest of Europe and its allies? For deeper insights, let's look in our panelists. I'm so glad to be joined by this panel of analysts and thinkers. In Paris, Joab Toker, professor from American Graduate School in Paris. In Brussels, Fraser Cameron, senior advisor from the European Policy Center. Last but not least, Professor Wang Yiwei, the Monet Chair Professor and Director of the Center for EU Studies with Renmin University of China. Thank you for joining us. Now, are you surprised? What is your first reaction to the presidential election result? Professor Toker, very briefly.
There are certainly challenges ahead, that's for sure. But on the short run, as for the coming 2 months or so, we still have to wait to see which way goes the parliamentary elections. The French call them the législatives, which are supposed to elect 577 members of parliament. Mm-hmm. Now, the president, of course, has a lot of power according to the French constitution, but he also needs a government, an operational one, and hopefully one which will go his way.
Dr. Cameron, what do you think? What is your first response to the result?
I didn't expect Marine Le Pen to win, but I think it would have been rather closer than the final result. So I think I personally, and I think most people, certainly in Brussels, are very relieved that Macron got such a resounding victory.
Professor Wang, it seems that most of the world are feeling relieved, even many in China, in a way.
Well, I think most of the Chinese also predict Macron will be re-elected. However, I think this is a Macron 2.0. Different with 5 years ago. There have so many people against, not him, because also against the mainstream of the party and ideology. Particularly for the young French, they're very unsatisfied, either Macron or Le Pen. So it's a big challenge for him.
Mr. Cameron, what do you think has managed to help Macron to be able to win in such a way?
Well, he obviously reached out after the first round towards the voters on the left. He watered down some of these policies which are probably economically important for France, like raising the retirement age to 65, but said this would be done over a longer period. He reduced some other promises as well in order to win over a surprisingly large percentage of vote for the left-wing candidate, Mélenchon. He almost, defeated Marine Le Pen, in fact. So I think he moved in that direction, tried to improve his green credentials as well. And I think when the French looked at it, they said, well, do we really want such a big shakeup at this time of global turbulence? Or do we want to go ahead with Macron, who has promised incremental reforms? And that's finally what decided the outcome.
Foreign policy has been what President Macron and now President-elect Macron has been focusing on right before the election, including about the Russia-Ukraine issue, very different or independent stance compared to that of Washington, for example. How much do you think, Professor Toker, even though being allies, but having quite an independent approach by President Macron has been having an impact on his election result? Some say foreign policy doesn't matter that much, but maybe these days things are different.
It's a nuanced and dynamic process here. If you follow the last 2 months before the elections, namely the 8 weeks or so during which there is a war in Ukraine, you see that the first 2-3 weeks, right after the beginning of hostilities, Macron had enjoyed, electorally speaking, if you follow the polls, had profited in a very significant way due to the fact that there was a major tension situation, and due also to the fact that on top of being the president of France, he is right now on a periodic basis the president of the EU. He went to Moscow. He was frequently on the phone with both the presidents of Russia and Ukraine and all over the world. He was very active, and he incarnated, in view of the French electorate, the international status of France in a reassuring way. But then after the third week or so, namely during the last month which preceded the voting day, these impacts went down and were rebalanced by more internally minded issues.
We see that change in the voters' attention. However, Mr. Cameron, how much do you see about the choice that President Macron made, mainly making this election pretty much about foreign policy, at least days even before the election, rather than just the domestic issues? What does that mean about the voters in France? What does it say about priorities these days people have in their minds?
Well, he was trying to do two things. He was trying to portray himself as the international statesman, which, as my colleague said, is what the French voters want to see. But secondly, he did focus, because he was pushed by Marine Le Pen into focusing more on domestic issues. And he came across as someone who tried to understand what had happened going back to the time of the Gilets jaunes in France, saying, I understand and I can do. And this is also the message he tried to portray after his election victory. I would just add one point, though. I think he did make a success in the TV debate, trying to portray Marine Le Pen as Putin's puppet, because the Kremlin has essentially been bankrolling, paying money to the Front National. And I think that hit home to the voters. Do we really want someone as president who's basically been funded by Putin?
So you think pretty much the stance about Russia and about President Putin in a way define the result of the French foreign policy, of the French election?
It had an impact on some people, certainly. I mean, it wasn't the dominant issue, but, I was saying there was a mix between foreign policy issues and domestic issues, and I think he got the balance right.
Professor Wang, French presidents, French diplomats are all known for being independent at critical times. If you think about the Iraq war, then the French president, the French prime minister were all expressing very different opinions compared to that of the United States. Now, Professor Wang, what do you make of French voters' attention on foreign policy, on being statesman as the president?
Foreign policy connected highly on the domestic affairs, like the oil price, of the inflation, of the economic growth, comparative advantages, and also digital sovereignty, climate change, everything. So in this regard, I think that it's easy for Le Pen to criticize Macron, but difficult for Le Pen or any other candidates to have more effective solutions for France. So French presidency of the European Council and Macron himself, a very young, dynamic leadership in the European integration, even in the West in general, as he indicated 2 years ago. He said to all the ambassadors of France, come back in the summer, that France actually is a defender of the Western values, but this Western-centric of the world is declining. So France has a special responsibility in guarantee of that the Western supremacy, values of their liberty, liberty, fraternity, and equality of the French Revolution. So that's I think French voters will care about so much.
Mr. Cameron, after the election, where do you think the French foreign policy might be heading for, spearheaded by President Macron?
Well, I think he's made no secret. He wants a stronger Europe. He's been very clear from the first day of his first term that he saw Europe and France as being the same. And he wants what he calls strategic autonomy, Europe to take more responsibility for its own defense, for its own economy, and to play a stronger role in the world. And he will continue to push for that. So I don't think there's going to be any change there.
Professor Toker.
He actually believes that it's not only a global, extremely important project, a reinforcement of the EU, but this is the way France is going to preserve its influence, its impact on world affairs.
All of you keep on talking about the word Europe or the EU. Now, does the meaning of that been changing over the past few years, particularly with the recent events? We see more European countries, especially EU members, joining the NATO. And also we see some kinds of ever closer partnership between the United States and the European allies. Now, even though some suggest it could be a short-term phenomenon due to the crisis right now. Now, Professor Cameron, tell me more, Dr. Cameron, about this. What do you think is the Europe that Macron has in mind from his campaign speeches and his policy lines?
Well, I think it's important that it's not just France who's got a pro-European leader. We've got a very pro-European government in Germany, in Italy, in Spain. And an interesting result even came from Slovenia over the weekend, for the anti-EU president was kicked out and a more pro-European party was in. So I think these results overall show that probably with the traditional French-German tandem in the lead, Europe is prepared now to actually move forward, and they don't have to worry about the Brits dragging their feet on new proposals anymore. Secondly, I think it's really important you have a very pro-EU administration in Washington. Biden and his team, Blinken and the others, know Europe well, and they know they perhaps only have a 3-year opportunity before the next presidential elections to really move forward on transatlantic relations. And this will tie in with a new partnership between the EU and an expanded NATO, because I'm pretty sure that within the next few months, you'll have Sweden and Finland both joining NATO as well. So there's a lot of movement, but it's going to lead to a stronger Europe and a stronger transatlantic partnership, that's for certain.
A stronger transatlantic partnership, but does that necessarily mean a stronger Europe? Many wonder, Professor Cameron.
Yeah, Europe has to take more of the burden, and we've seen what the Germans call a Zeitenwende, a real sea change in terms of what the Germans, the biggest economy in Europe, is now going to do on the defense front. I mean, Scholz said recently, Germany will spend 100 billion euros, massive, make Germany the biggest military spender in Europe, which will also have wider consequences beyond Europe. So things are really changing in Europe. And I think you're going to see a much stronger, more cohesive Europe. There'll still be obvious bickerings and fights over certain issues, but the essential unity and desire to move forward, especially by the leading member states, is beyond any doubt.
Now, Professor Wang, tell me more about your thoughts.
I think the Macron has his ambitions to push forward to the fiscal integration by maybe increase the digital tax or the cross the border of the carbon tax, and also push for more on the Indo-Pacific strategy. They're definitely different with the US. It's a more military security concern. The France think about the resident power in the Indo-Pacific. They may pay more attention to Africa, to the data and freedom of navigation and mutual connectivity. and also on strategic industries and maybe policies, which also give their space for China and France and in general China and the EU cooperate in their nuclear energy and in their aerospace and also high technology. Otherwise, a strategic autonomy is just an empty saying.
Macron as the president likely to reconcile or balance his aspiration to be an international statesman, for example, about cooperation with China and working on the crisis of Russia-Ukraine, and his our friend's determination to be playing a leading role within the EU or on the European continent. Dr. Cameron.
He's a very talented person, Mr. Macron, but he's not a magician, and you have to set priorities. And for the coming months, and we don't know how long the Russia-Ukraine war will go on for, this will be the #1 priority for everybody in Europe because it's an existential problem. It's a question of changing the accepted international standards, changing borders by force, something that Europe thought was finished, and we all have to stand up for that. Otherwise, Europe could descend into chaos. So other priorities further afield, whether Africa, Indo-Pacific, will unfortunately have to take a back seat until the situation in Europe is resolved.
We see some of the European countries follow up with the kind of sanctions that the US imposed on Russia. We see some of the other European countries that at this moment still hesitate to do so. Dr. Cameron, where is France right now, do you think?
France has been to the fore in imposing sanctions right in the European mainstream. It's taken a big hit. It had lots of investments both in Russia and Ukraine. But Macron has been very clear that you simply cannot accept this kind of behavior on the European continent. So France has been lined up with everyone else and leading the sanctions pact.
Yes, I basically agree. I will only add that the longer the security situation, namely the war situation in Ukraine, lasts, the more complicated would be a progress in proper European foreign policy and defense policies, which are the ambition of President Macron. Because the war situation obliges Europe as a whole, and France in particular, which always had more independent, more original ideas regarding the transatlantic relations, the bilateral relations with Washington, and French independent foreign policy regarding Africa and Asia and elsewhere. But as long as the war is on, there is no space for nuances there. And indeed, France follows and participates actively in the overall transatlantic, rather united policy against Russia. So when the war is over, if the war is over, then we could see more nuanced elements there, which would bring back to the forehand some initiatives of France historically and Mr. Macron punctually to introduce more independent layers in French foreign policy.
I think the sanctions have their strategic consequences. It's not just of the people pay more price for the oil or inflation. One of the major consequences is so-called the re-industrialization as prohibited, because actually Germany, they want to use a cheap oil and gas and coal from Russia to as the way of producing use, not just the way of living. The so-called re-industrialization that completed with the United States. Now, this is the so-called Nord Stream pipelines cut. European Union not just rely on military security on the NATO and the US, and even energy also depends on the United States. And then there's in the long term, well, undermine the comparative advantage of the European economy. US, they also re-industrialized, digitalized. And then European Union relatively declining on that kind of the long term, because they don't have Google. 90% of the data in Europe are in Google's hand. Actually, 30 US ICT companies, the values is amount of the 5 major economies, including UK in Europe. So European Union can be an independent pillar in the multipolar world, question mark, after the Ukraine crisis.
Can it be, Dr. Cameron?
Yes, I mean, I think the Europeans recognize they're way behind the Americans in some areas of tech, but I mean, they are catching up and have got some excellent companies. Plus they have niche markets available in very many other areas, particularly in the green economy. So I've no doubt that Europe will recover and do well. I think the problem is going to be for the global economy as a whole, because, you know, China is obviously not got the buying power given the ongoing situation in China. The supply chains have been blocked in many areas. So it's going to take some time, and there's no easy solutions before the world economy gets back to performing as it should.
The world is in a great transformation from the industrial to digitalized world, and also for green sustainable growth, and for financial and that kind of trend. The European Union actually will have indeed with a very important but a very difficult with the structural reform to get their advantage in the new economy, digital economy, green economy, and financial as well. So China support Paris as a global financial center. China also has support the European Union with the green transformation and digital transformation. So that's the reason I think we welcome Macron re-elected, and then not just a leading role in France, but also in general in European Union to have a more strategic cooperation with China. Otherwise, the European Union is more actually live in the shadow of the US influence.
Now we see China-US pretty much being interpreted by many as in a competition relationship, if not rivalry. Usually those words are mainly used by Washington. China has refused to accept a way of saying rivalry to describe the bilateral relations. But what does it leave to the Europeans, particularly to President Macron during his next few years in office, about having a good relationship with China? What is that relationship going to be based on, Mr. Cameron?
Well, it's difficult to have good relations with China if China gives unconditional support to Russia in its war against Ukraine. I mean, for Europeans, that's an existential threat. So that's why the last summit between the EU and China didn't produce any results. The EU wanted to focus on what was happening on this horrible war. China wanted to discuss wider issues. Well, there is an agenda for discussing wider issues, and obviously with things like climate change, really very important, and this will go on. But the idea that we can have normal business relations with China while China is supporting Russia, that's not going to happen, unfortunately.
Sorry, I think China is not unconditionally support of Russia. There definitely is a condition. That condition is on the base of the principles of the UN Charter and international law. So China and Russia is not allies, not like NATO member relations. And also we have, we didn't buy so much of oil and gas from Russia. Who buy more? India and the US.
This is a very complicated issue, gentlemen, indeed, that you just talked about. So during a time of geopolitical tensions, countries usually are forced to take sides, either with one camp, quote unquote, or with another camp. France, what about its ability and capability to refuse that for the greatest benefits of its own interests?
The France interests, as we've been discussing, are more and more identified with the European interests. And there is only one major European interest. You look at the media, the political coverage all over Europe, it's about Ukraine, Ukraine, Ukraine. And until we resolve that issue, it's going to be very, very difficult to move forward on any other front, because that is, for the Europeans, an existential threat. There's no other way to describe it.
Professor Toker.
Indeed, that's the punctual picture right now. But on the long run, and it comes back to Macron's ambition regarding Europe and some other European leaders and political parties regarding tomorrow's Europe. The question is the two shores of the Atlantic are condemned somehow because of the overall geostrategic situation to be together all along the front. And we will find sort of a bipolar world, not right now, but tomorrow and the day after tomorrow, in which we have two blocks, the Americans and the Europeans on one hand, and the Chinese with others, mainly the Russians, on the other. But this is not Macron's ambition. Macron's ambition is to have Europe with an independent, significant influence in growth. And as long as the security situation, the war, dominates the situation, he cannot move.
I think before we go, I would love to hear from you. What do you think if you were asked by President Macron to be the next priority he should seek or he should work on?
Energy. No question.
Well,
I mean, it also has geopolitical consequences. So for Europe, energy is going to be the #1 issue. You've seen a sea change of attitudes in Germany. One also is going to have to look for alternative supplies, whether it's nuclear, LNG, new contracts with countries like, Algeria and Qatar and the Middle East. So that is going to dominate, I think, in terms of because it has an impact on the cost of living. It has an impact, on politics and security. So energy will be the #1 issue.
Professor Toker.
I would say that internationally speaking, on the world scene, it would be trying to push forward some kind of apparatus of mechanism which would produce European foreign policy. It doesn't exist. Internally, however, the major priority for Macron right now is really to appease the social internal scene because things are going badly on that direction, and he has to do something and urgently in order to achieve more social peace at home.
Okay. Professor Wang.
Security. The Ukraine crisis will be long-term. People worry about even like a Pakistan-India conflict. It lasted decades. The European Union is a tragedy that security is not in the hands of the European people. It's in the hands of NATO and the US. So France, whatever your strong leadership in European integration economically, but security, you cannot cease the fire. The confrontation with Russia will be long-term. So that's, in this regard, is a top priority for France, for any other member state of the European Union, to solve the problem, given the shadow of the Ukraine crisis and the war.
Wang Yiwei, Joab Toker, last but not least, Fraser Cameron. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for joining us. Really appreciate it. That's our panel discussion on French presidential election. With that, we're coming to the end of today's program. If you'd like to know more, search World Insight or check out our YouTube channel, follow us on Twitter and Facebook. I'm Tian Wei. On behalf of my team, thanks for being with us. Bye for now.